The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of the Grand Vista Hotel as Robert Bob Mitchell pulled his weathered pickup truck into a space near the entrance. The truck had seen better days, much like Bob himself. Rust spots dotted the blue paint, and the tailgate bore a faded Marine Corps sticker that had been there for over 30 years. Bob sat for a moment, his calloused hands gripping the steering wheel as he stared at the imposing glass facade of the hotel. At 68 years old, Bob carried himself with the straight-back posture that never quite leaves a Marine, despite the slight limp in his left leg that served as a daily reminder of his time in Vietnam. His silver hair was cut short, military style, and his weathered face told stories of both hardship and resilience. Today was special. Today marked 50 years since he had returned from Southeast Asia, and his daughter Sarah had insisted on treating him to a weekend at this upscale hotel to commemorate the milestone. Bob had protested, of course. He wasn't comfortable with fancy places or spending money on what he considered unnecessary luxuries. His small apartment above the hardware store where he worked part-time suited him just fine. But Sarah had been persistent, and Bob had learned long ago that when his daughter set her mind to something, resistance was futile. She had booked him a room for 3 nights and even arranged for him to attend a veterans gathering in the hotel's conference room that evening. As Bob climbed out of his truck, he straightened his simple button-down shirt and adjusted the baseball cap that bore the Marine Corps emblem. His jeans were clean but well-worn, and his work boots had been polished for the occasion, though they still showed signs of honest labor. He retrieved his small duffel bag from the truck bed, the same olive green bag he had carried in Vietnam, and made his way toward the hotel entrance. The Grand Vista Hotel was the kind of establishment that catered to business executives and wealthy tourists. The lobby gleamed with marble floors and crystal chandeliers, and the staff wore crisp uniforms that probably cost more than Bob's entire outfit. As he approached the front desk, Bob felt the familiar discomfort that came with being out of his element, but he pushed forward with the same determination that had carried him through jungle patrols decades earlier. Behind a reception desk stood a young woman named Jessica, barely out of college, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a practiced smile. She looked up as Bob approached, her eyes quickly taking in his appearance with a trained assessment of someone accustomed to categorizing guests by their apparent wealth and status. Her smile faltered slightly, though she maintained her professional demeanor. "Good afternoon, sir. How may I help you today?" Jessica's voice was polite, but carried a subtle coolness that Bob noticed immediately. "I have a reservation under Mitchell." "Robert Mitchell," Bob replied, his voice steady despite feeling increasingly out of place in the opulent surroundings. Jessica's fingers danced across the keyboard as she pulled up the reservation. "Yes, I see it here. A 3-night stay in one of our standard rooms. The rate is $450 per night, plus taxes and fees." Bob nodded, reaching for his wallet. He had saved for months to afford this trip, despite Sarah's insistence that she would pay. His pride wouldn't allow him to accept such an expensive gift from his daughter, who was working hard to raise 2 children on her teacher's salary. As he fumbled with his worn leather wallet, a small plastic card fell to the marble floor with a soft click. Bob bent down to retrieve the card, his movements careful due to his old injury. The card was his Veterans Administration identification, clearly marked with the VA logo and his status as a disabled veteran. As he straightened up, card in hand, he noticed Jessica watching him with an expression of mild impatience. "I'm sorry about that," Bob said, holding up the VA card. "I was wondering if you offer any discounts for veterans. I know some places do, and I thought I'd ask." The question was asked quietly, without any sense of entitlement or demand. Bob had never been the type to expect special treatment, but his limited budget meant that even a small discount would be meaningful. He had seen signs at various businesses over the years advertising veteran discounts, though he rarely took advantage of them. Jessica's expression shifted, and she let out a small, barely audible sigh. "Sir, this is the Grand Vista Hotel. We don't typically offer discounts of any kind. Our rates are set at market value, and we maintain our standard accordingly." The words hit Bob like a physical blow, though he kept his expression neutral. It wasn't just the denial of the discount that stung, but the way Jessica delivered the message, as if his request was somehow inappropriate or beneath the hotel's dignity. Her tone suggested that someone like him should have known better than to ask for such a thing at an establishment like this. "I understand," Bob replied quietly, returning his VA card to his wallet. "I was just asking. I'll pay the full rate." As Bob reached for his credit card, he noticed a man in an expensive suit watching the interaction from across the lobby. The man appeared to be in his 40s, with carefully styled dark hair, and the kind of confident bearing that suggested he was accustomed to being the most important person in any room. This was Marcus Delacroix, the hotel's general manager, though Bob had no way of knowing this at the time. Marcus had built his career on maintaining the Grand Vista's reputation as an exclusive destination. He prided himself on the hotel's ability to attract wealthy clientele and had little patience for what he considered undesirable elements that might detract from the establishment's ambience. He had been watching Bob since the moment the older man entered the lobby, noting his simple clothes and aged vehicle through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Jessica processed Bob's payment, her movements efficient but lacking warmth. She handed him a key card and gestured toward the elevators without making eye contact. "Room 814. Elevators are to your right. Checkout is at 11 a.m. on Monday." Bob thanked her politely and made his way toward the elevators, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. As he walked across the expansive lobby, he was acutely aware of the other guests and staff members watching him with varying degrees of curiosity and judgment. Their eyes seemed to take in every detail of his appearance, from his work boots to his simple clothes, and he could almost hear their unspoken questions about what someone like him was doing in a place like this. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and Bob stepped inside alongside a well-dressed couple who immediately moved to the far corner, as if trying to distance themselves from him. The woman whispered something to her companion, and Bob caught the words maintenance and lost, suggesting they assumed he was some kind of worker who had wandered into the guest areas by mistake. Room 814 was on the 8th floor, and Bob found it easily enough. The room was undeniably nice, with a king-sized bed, elegant furniture, and a view of the city that Sarah would have loved. But as Bob set his duffel bag on the luggage rack and looked around the spacious accommodations, he couldn't shake the feeling of being unwelcome. He had faced discrimination before, though it usually centered around his status as a Vietnam veteran rather than his economic circumstances. In the years immediately following his return from Southeast Asia, Bob had encountered hostility and indifference from a public that had grown weary of an unpopular war. But this felt different somehow, more personal and cutting. Bob unpacked his few belongings, hanging his one dress shirt in the closet and placing his toiletries in the marble bathroom. Everything about the room spoke of luxury and comfort, yet he found himself longing for the simplicity of his small apartment above the hardware store. There he belonged. There, no one questioned his right to be present or looked at him with barely concealed disdain. As the afternoon wore on, Bob tried to settle into the rhythm of hotel life. He walked the hallways, familiarizing himself with the layout, and even ventured down to the hotel's restaurant to look at the menu. The prices were astronomical by his standards, and he decided he would stick to the small diner he had noticed down the street for his meals. The veterans' gathering wasn't scheduled to begin until 7 o'clock that evening, so Bob had time to kill. He considered calling Sarah to tell her about his arrival, but decided against it. She would ask how everything was going, and he didn't want to dampen her enthusiasm by mentioning the chilly reception he had received at check-in. Sarah had worked hard to arrange this trip, and Bob was determined to make the best of it, regardless of how unwelcome he felt. Instead, Bob found himself drawn to the hotel's small business center, where a few computers were available for guest use. He wasn't particularly comfortable with technology, but Sarah had been trying to teach him to use email so they could communicate more easily. Perhaps this would be a good opportunity to practice. As Bob sat at one of the computers, struggling with the unfamiliar interface, he noticed Marcus Delacroix enter the business center with another man in an equally expensive suit. They spoke in low tones, but Bob couldn't help overhearing fragments of their conversation. The veteran demographic just doesn't align with our target market, Marcus was saying. We need to be more selective about the events we host. These military gatherings tend to attract the wrong sort of clientele. The words hit Bob like a punch to the gut. He realized they were talking about the very event he was planning to attend that evening, the gathering that Sarah had been so excited about when she made the reservation. Bob's hands stilled on the keyboard as he listened, his military training allowing him to remain motionless while gathering intelligence. I understand the concern about image, the other man replied, but we did accept their deposit, and the contract is signed. Canceling now would create legal complications. Marcus sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. Yes, I know, but after this, we need to implement stricter guidelines about who can book our event spaces. The Grand Vista has a reputation to maintain, and we can't afford to have our lobby filled with. He paused, searching for the right words. With people who don't represent our brand values. Bob felt his chest tighten with anger and hurt. These men were talking about him, and veterans like him, as if they were some kind of problem to be managed or eliminated. The casual dismissal of their worth, their right to be treated with dignity and respect, ignited something deep within Bob that had been dormant for years. He had served his country in Vietnam, had seen friends die in rice paddies and jungle clearings, had carried the physical and emotional scars of that service for 5 decades. He had worked hard, paid his taxes, raised a daughter, and lived his life with honor and integrity. Yet here he was being discussed as if he were somehow unworthy of basic human courtesy because his clothes weren't expensive enough or his truck wasn't new enough. Bob saved the email he had been composing to Sarah, a simple message telling her he had arrived safely, and quietly left the business center. Marcus and his companion were so engrossed in their conversation about maintaining the hotel's exclusive image that they didn't notice the older man in work clothes who had been listening to every word. Back in his room, Bob sat on the edge of the king-size bed and stared out at the city skyline. The view was spectacular, but he barely saw it. Instead, his mind was churning with emotions he hadn't felt this intensely in years. Part of him wanted to pack his bag, check out immediately, and drive back to the familiar comfort of his small apartment. He could call Sarah and make up some excuse about not feeling well or having an emergency at the hardware store. But another part of him, the part that had been forged in the crucible of military service, rebelled against the idea of retreat. He had not survived the jungles of Vietnam and the challenges of civilian life only to be driven away by the snobbery and prejudice of a hotel manager who had probably never faced a real hardship in his life. As evening approached, Bob made a decision. He would attend the veterans' gathering as planned. He would hold his head high and conduct himself with the same dignity and honor that had carried him through his military service. If Marcus Delacroix and people like him wanted to judge him based on his appearance or economic status, that said more about them than it did about him. Bob put on his dress shirt, the one good shirt he owned, and checked his appearance in the mirror. The shirt was a few years old but clean and pressed. His pants were his best pair, and his shoes, while not expensive, were polished to a military shine. He looked like what he was, a working man who had served his country with honor and was trying to maintain his dignity in a world that didn't always value such things. As he prepared to leave his room for the veterans' gathering, Bob caught his reflection in the mirror one more time. The face looking back at him showed every one of his 68 years, etched with lines earned through hard work and harder times. But there was something else there too, something that Marcus Delacroix and Jessica at the front desk had failed to see. The quiet strength of a man who had faced down enemies both foreign and domestic, who had weathered storms that would have broken lesser men, and who still believed in the fundamental dignity of every human being. Bob adjusted his Marine Corps cap and headed for the door. Whatever happened at the veterans' gathering, whatever additional slights or indignities awaited him in the hotel's elegant corridors, he would face them with the same courage that had sustained him through darker times in distant jungles. The boy from small-town America, who had answered his country's call 50 years ago, might have been shaped by war and hardship, but he had not been broken by them. The elevator doors closed behind him as Bob descended toward the lobby, toward a gathering of men and women who shared his experiences and understood his sacrifices. For the first time since arriving at the Grand Vista Hotel, he felt a spark of anticipation. These were his people, regardless of what Marcus Delacroix or anyone else thought about their worthiness to occupy space in this marble and crystal palace. As the elevator reached the lobby level, Bob straightened his shoulders and prepared to walk across that intimidating expanse of polished floor once more. This time, however, he carried himself with the knowledge that his worth was not determined by the opinions of those who had never served anything greater than their own comfort and profit. Whatever came next, Bob Mitchell would face it as he had faced everything else in his life, with quiet courage and unshakable dignity. The hotel's conference room had been transformed for the evening's veteran gathering. Round tables covered with crisp white linens dotted the space, and small American flags served as centerpieces alongside simple floral arrangements. Bob entered the room and immediately felt the atmosphere shift around him like a warm embrace. Here, among his brothers and sisters in arms, the judgment and cold stares that had followed him through the hotel's lobby seemed to melt away. The first person Bob encountered was a woman in her early 60s with short gray hair and laugh lines around bright blue eyes. She wore a simple blue dress and a pin on her lapel that identified her as a Navy veteran. Her name tag read Dorothy Walsh, USS Sanctuary, 1968 to 1972. "Welcome," Dorothy said, extending her hand with genuine warmth. "I don't think we've met. I'm Dorothy, but everyone calls me Bob Mitchell, Marines 1967 to 1970. Bob replied, accepting her handshake and feeling some of the tension leave his shoulders. "Vietnam?" But asked, though something in Bob's bearing had already given her the answer. "Yes, ma'am. 2 tours. Dot's expression grew more serious, and she placed her other hand on Bob's arm. "Welcome home, Marine. Better late than never, right?" The simple phrase hit Bob harder than he had expected. Welcome home was something Vietnam veterans had rarely heard upon their return, and even 50 years later, it carried tremendous weight. Bob felt his throat tighten slightly as he nodded his thanks. Dot led Bob further into the room, introducing him to other veterans who had gathered for the evening. There was Frank Kowalski, a tall, thin man who had served with the Air Force in Thailand, working on the aircraft that supported operations in Vietnam. Maria Santos had been an Army nurse who had seen action in the closing days of the war. Jimmy Patterson, despite being confined to a wheelchair due to injuries sustained in combat, maintained an infectious sense of humor that had everyone around his table laughing. As Bob moved through the room, he felt a transformation taking place within himself. Here, his worn clothes and working man's appearance were not sources of judgment, but badges of authenticity. These people understood that real worth wasn't measured in designer labels or luxury automobiles, but in character, service, and the quiet dignity of those who had answered their nation's call in its hour of need. The evening's program began with a brief presentation by the local Veterans Administration representative, a young man named David Chun, who spoke with genuine respect about the services available to Vietnam-era veterans. Bob listened carefully, learning about benefits he hadn't known existed and programs designed to help veterans like himself navigate the challenges of aging with service-connected disabilities. Following the formal presentation, the gathering became more informal, with veterans sharing stories and reconnecting with experiences that had shaped their lives. Bob found himself at a table with 6 other Marines, all of whom had served in Vietnam during roughly the same time period. As they shared memories of their service, Bob felt a sense of belonging that had been missing from his life for far too long. "You know what I miss most?" said Tony Morales, a stocky man with graying hair who had served as a radio operator. "The brotherhood. Civilian life, everyone's out for themselves. In country, you knew the guy next to you had your back, no matter what." The others nodded in understanding. Bob had felt this same sense of loss for decades, the absence of the deep bonds forged in shared hardship and danger. In civilian life, relationships seemed more superficial, more transactional. The unconditional loyalty and trust that had existed between Marines in combat was something that couldn't be replicated in the everyday world. I tried to explain it to my wife once, added Charlie Brennan, whose weathered hands bore scars from shrapnel wounds. She's a good woman, don't get me wrong, but she doesn't understand why I still think about guys I served with 45 years ago. She thinks I should just move on and focus on the present. Bob found himself sharing more than he had intended about his own struggles with readjustment. He spoke about the nightmares that still came occasionally, the way certain sounds or smells could transport him back to the jungle in an instant, and the isolation he had felt for so many years. These men understood in ways that even his beloved daughter Sarah never could, despite her best efforts to comprehend her father's experiences. As the evening progressed, Bob learned that several of his table mates had also faced challenges related to their economic circumstances. Tony worked as a night security guard, struggling to make ends meet on a modest income. Charlie had been laid off from his factory job 2 years earlier and was working part-time at a grocery store while battling health problems related to Agent Orange exposure. Despite their hardships, these men maintained their dignity and their sense of honor. "The thing that gets me," Charlie said, lowering his voice, "is how people treat you different when they think you don't have money. Like your service don't matter if you're not driving a fancy car or wearing expensive clothes." The comment resonated deeply with Bob, bringing back the sting of his earlier encounter with Jessica at the front desk and Marcus Delacroix's dismissive words in the business center. He found himself sharing the details of his arrival at the hotel, the cold reception he had received, and the conversation he had overheard about veterans not representing the hotel's brand values. The reaction from his table mates was immediate and intense. Tony's face flushed with anger, while Charlie's hands clenched into fists. The other Marines expressed their outrage in colorful language that would have been perfectly at home in a military barracks, but seemed somewhat out of place in the elegant conference room. "That's complete bullshit," Tony said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "We served our country while that manager was probably still in diapers, and he's got the nerve to act like we're not good enough for his precious hotel. Some people got no respect for what we went through," added Charlie. "They see the uniform or the veteran cap and think we're looking for handouts. They don't understand we earned everything we got, and then some." Bob appreciated their solidarity, but he also felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders. This was the burden he had carried for 50 years, the knowledge that his service, his sacrifices, and his dignity as a human being were often invisible to those who had never faced the challenges of war or the struggles of working-class life. As the formal portion of the evening wound down, several veterans exchanged contact information and made plans to stay in touch. Bob found himself with a handful of business cards and phone numbers, along with invitations to other veteran gatherings and events. For the first time in years, he felt connected to something larger than himself, part of a community that valued his experiences and understood his journey. Dorothy Walsh approached Bob as he was preparing to leave. "Bob, I hope you'll consider joining our monthly meetings. We get together the first Saturday of every month at the VFW Hall. Nothing fancy, just coffee and conversation, but it's good to stay connected." "I'd like that," Bob replied, surprised by how much he meant it. He had avoided veteran organizations for years, partly out of pride and partly out of reluctance to dwell on the past. But tonight had shown him the value of community, the healing power of being understood by those who had walked similar paths. As Bob made his way back through the hotel lobby toward the elevators, he noticed that the evening shift had taken over. Jessica was nowhere to be seen, replaced by an older man with kind eyes who nodded politely as Bob passed the front desk. The lobby was quieter now, with fewer guests moving about, and Bob felt less conspicuous as he crossed the marble expanse. Back in his room, Bob sat on the edge of the bed and reflected on the evening's events. The contrast between his reception in the veteran gathering and his treatment by the hotel staff was stark and troubling. Among his fellow veterans, he had been welcomed, respected, and valued for who he was and what he had contributed. In the hotel's public spaces, he had been made to feel like an intruder, someone whose presence diminished the establishment's carefully cultivated image. Bob pulled out his cell phone, a basic model that Sarah had insisted he carry for emergencies, and considered calling his daughter. She would want to know how the veteran gathering had gone, and he could honestly tell her it had been wonderful. But he found himself reluctant to mention the other aspects of his hotel experience. Sarah had worked hard to arrange this special weekend, and Bob didn't want to dampen her enthusiasm with complaints about poor treatment. Instead, Bob decided to compose an email to Sarah using the hotel's business center. He wanted to thank her properly for her thoughtfulness and tell her about the veterans he had met. As he made his way back down to the lobby, Bob noticed that Marcus Delacroix was standing near the concierge desk, speaking with a well-dressed couple about dinner reservations and an exclusive restaurant. Marcus's voice carried across the lobby as he assured the couple that they would receive preferential treatment at the restaurant based on their status as Grand Vista guests. "We maintain relationships with only the finest establishments," Marcus was saying, "places that understand the caliber of clientele we serve." Bob paused near a decorative pillar, not intentionally eavesdropping, but unable to avoid hearing the conversation. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here was a man who prided himself on the exclusive nature of his establishment, yet he had no understanding of the true exclusivity of military service, the select group of Americans who had voluntarily put themselves in harm's way for their country. In the business center, Bob found the computer he had used earlier and began composing his email to Sarah. He wrote about Dorothy and the other veterans he had met, about the sense of camaraderie and understanding that had filled the conference room, and about the plans they had made to stay in touch. He described the warm welcome he had received and the feeling of belonging that had been absent from his life for so long. As Bob typed, he became aware that he was not alone in the business center. Marcus Delacroix had entered with a tablet and was reviewing what appeared to be financial reports. Bob continued working on his email, but he couldn't help noticing that Marcus seemed agitated about something. The manager was muttering under his breath and occasionally shaking his head in frustration. "The profit margins on these group bookings are terrible," Marcus was saying to himself. "All that wear and tear on the facilities, and for what? A bunch of people who barely spend money in the restaurant or bar." Bob's typing slowed as he realized that Marcus was likely referring to the veteran gathering. The casual dismissal of their event, their value as human beings reduced to profit margins and spending habits, ignited the anger that Bob had been suppressing all evening. Bob saved his email and quietly logged off the computer. As he stood to leave, Marcus looked up and seemed to notice him for the first time. There was a moment of awkward recognition as Marcus realized that this was the same man he had seen checking in earlier, the veteran whose demographic didn't align with their target market. "Everything satisfactory with your stay?" Marcus asked, his tone professional but lacking warmth. "It's fine," Bob replied evenly, though both men understood that the word carried more weight than it usually would. Marcus nodded curtly and returned his attention to his tablet, dismissing Bob with the same casual indifference he might show to a maintenance worker or delivery person. Bob left the business center feeling the familiar sting of being treated as invisible, a non-person whose presence was merely tolerated rather than welcomed. Back in his room, once again, Bob stood at the window looking out at the city lights. Tomorrow would bring a new day, and he had planned to explore some of the local museums and historical sites that Sarah had researched for him. The veterans gathering had been the highlight of his trip so far, but he still had 2 more nights at the hotel to endure. As Bob prepared for bed, he made a decision. He would not let Marcus Delacroix or anyone else make him feel ashamed of who he was or what he had accomplished. He was a United States Marine, a Vietnam veteran, a hard worker, and a good father. If that wasn't enough for the Grand Vista Hotel, then the problem lay with them, not with him. Bob set his alarm for 7 o'clock, planning to get an early start on his sightseeing. He had served his country with honor, had earned his place in society through decades of hard work and sacrifice, and he would not be made to feel otherwise by people who measured worth only in dollars and status symbols. As he settled into the luxurious bed that felt so foreign compared to his simple accommodations at home, Bob thought about the veterans he had met that evening. Each had faced their own struggles, their own challenges with readjustment and recognition. Yet they had maintained their dignity and their sense of brotherhood. Tomorrow, Bob would carry that same spirit with him as he explored the city, wearing his Marine Corps cap with pride and holding his head high despite the judgment of those who had never earned the right to wear a uniform or serve something greater than themselves. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with autumn sunlight streaming through the hotel room's large windows. Bob woke before his alarm, as was his habit after decades of military discipline and years of early shifts at the hardware store. He lay still for a moment, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the city awakening below, so different from the quiet mornings in a small town where he knew every sound and its source. After a simple breakfast at the diner down the street, Bob set out to explore the city's Military History Museum, a destination Sarah had specifically recommended. The museum was housed in a converted armory, and Bob felt a familiar sense of reverence as he approached the imposing brick structure. Inside, displays chronicled American military history from the Revolutionary War through the recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Bob found himself particularly drawn to the Vietnam War exhibit, though approaching it required emotional preparation he hadn't anticipated. The display featured personal artifacts donated by veterans, worn uniforms, faded photographs, letters home, and equipment that Bob recognized with the instant familiarity of shared experience. A mannequin wore the same type of jungle utilities Bob had worn in the field, complete with the gear that had been both burden and lifeline. As Bob studied a display case containing military decorations, a young voice behind him spoke up. "Excuse me, sir, but were you really there?" Bob turned to see a boy of perhaps 12, accompanied by what appeared to be his grandfather, a man roughly Bob's age wearing Korean War veteran cap. The boy's eyes were wide with curiosity and respect as he pointed to Bob's Marine Corps cap. "Yes, son, I was there," Bob replied, his voice gentle. "What was it like?" the boy asked, his question carrying the kind of innocent directness that only children possess. Bob considered his response carefully. How do you explain to a 12-year-old the complexity of war, the mixture of terror and brotherhood, the way combat can simultaneously destroy and forge the human spirit? "It was hard," Bob said finally, "but I'm proud I served with good Marines who looked out for each other." The boy's grandfather extended his hand. "Tom Richardson, 1st Infantry Division, Korea. Thank you for your service, Marine." "Bob Mitchell, and thank you for yours," Bob replied, accepting the handshake. It was a ritual familiar to veterans, this acknowledgement of shared experience across different conflicts and generations. "We come here every year on Veterans Day weekend," Tom explained. "I want Danny here to understand the price of freedom, to know that real heroes don't just exist in movies and video games." Bob spent the next hour walking through the museum with Tom and Danny, sharing stories and observations about the exhibits. It was refreshing to be with people who viewed his service with genuine respect rather than indifference or judgment. Danny asked thoughtful questions about military life, and Bob found himself opening up in ways he rarely did, even with Sarah. When they finally parted ways, Tom pressed a business card into Bob's hand. "I run a small veteran support group. Nothing fancy, just guys getting together to talk. You be welcome anytime." Bob pocketed the card, touched by the gesture. In less than 24 hours, he had received more genuine welcome from fellow veterans than he had experienced in years of civilian interactions. It reinforced his growing awareness of how much he had missed by isolating himself from the veteran community. The afternoon found Bob at another of Sarah's recommended destinations, a historic district with preserved buildings from the Civil War era. He walked the cobblestone streets at his own pace, stopping frequently to read historical markers and imagine the lives of those who had walked these same paths more than a century earlier. The autumn air was perfect for walking, crisp but not cold, and Bob found himself genuinely enjoying the solitary exploration. As evening approached, Bob made his way back toward the hotel district, planning to have dinner at the same diner where he had eaten breakfast. The prices were reasonable, the food was good, and the staff treated him like a regular customer rather than an unwelcome intruder. It was the kind of place where Bob felt comfortable, unpretentious, and welcoming. On his way to the diner, Bob passed a small park where a group of teenagers was harassing an elderly man sitting on a bench. The man appeared to be homeless, with worn clothes and a shopping cart containing his possessions. The teenagers were taunting him, calling him names, and threatening to overturn his cart. Bob's military training kicked in immediately. Assess the situation, identify the threat, determine the appropriate response. There were 4 teenagers, probably 16 or 17 years old, and they were clearly enjoying their dominance over someone they perceived as vulnerable. The elderly man was trying to ignore them, but Bob could see fear in his posture. "Hey," Bob called out as he approached the group. "Leave him alone." The teenagers turned toward Bob with the kind of manufactured aggression that comes from pack mentality and the assumption that their numbers gave them advantage. The apparent leader, a tall kid with expensive sneakers and an attitude of entitlement, looked Bob up and down with obvious disdain. "Mind your own business, old man," the teenager said. "This doesn't concern you." Bob continued walking toward them, his pace steady and purposeful. "I'm making it my business. Move along." "Or what?" Another teenager chimed in. "You gonna call the cops? You gonna fight all 4 of us?" Bob stopped about 6 feet from the group, close enough to act if necessary, but far enough to avoid seeming immediately threatening. His voice remained calm, but carried an unmistakable edge of authority. "I'm a United States Marine, son. I've faced down enemies you can't imagine, and I'm not about to be intimidated by a bunch of kids who get their kicks picking on people who can't fight back." There was something in Bob's bearing, in the quiet confidence of his words and the steady way he held their gaze, that made the teenagers reconsider their position. The leader tried to maintain his bravado, but Bob could see uncertainty creeping into his expression. "Whatever, man," the leader said finally. "Come on, guys, this place is boring anyway." The group moved away, their parting comments designed to save face, but lacking the conviction they had shown moments earlier. Bob watched them go, then turned his attention to the elderly man on the bench. "You okay?" Bob asked, his voice gentle now. The man looked up with grateful eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Most people just walk by." Bob sat down on the bench beside him. The man appeared to be in his 70s, with a weathered skin and hollow look of someone who had lived rough for an extended period. His clothes were clean, but worn, and his shopping cart was neatly organized despite containing everything he owned. "I'm Bob," he said, extending his hand. "Eddie," the man replied, accepting the handshake. "Eddie Kowalski." The last name caught Bob's attention. "You wouldn't be related to Frank Kowalski by any chance?" "Air Force, served in Thailand during Vietnam." Eddie's eyes widened in surprise. "Frank's my younger brother." "How do you know Frank?" Bob explained about the veterans gathering at the hotel the night before, how he had met Frank and learned about his service. As the conversation continued, Bob learned that Eddie had also served in Vietnam as an Army infantryman, but had struggled with post-traumatic stress and alcohol abuse upon his return. A series of bad decisions and worse luck had eventually led to his current situation on the streets. "Frank doesn't know where I am," Eddie said, his voice heavy with shame. "Last time we talked, I was pretty messed up. Said some things I shouldn't have said. He's got a good life now, wife and kids. I didn't want to drag him down." Bob understood the complexity of family relationships, complicated by war's aftermath and personal struggles. He had seen it many times over the years. Veterans who felt their problems were burdens too heavy to share, even with those who loved them most. "Frank mentioned you last night," Bob said carefully. "Said he wishes he could find you, that he thinks about you all the time." Eddie's eyes filled with tears that he quickly wiped away. "He said that." "He did. Maybe it's time to reach out." They talked for another 20 minutes as the sun set over the city. Bob learned that Eddie had been living on the streets for nearly 2 years, getting by on veterans' disability payments and the kindness of strangers. He had tried several times to get back on his feet, but The combination of mental health issues and a tight housing market had made stable housing elusive. When Bob finally stood to leave for dinner, he pressed two $20 bills into Eddie's hand despite the older man's protests. "Get yourself a decent meal," Bob said, "and think about calling your brother." "I don't have a phone," Eddie replied. Bob pulled out his simple cell phone and scrolled to Frank's number, which he had entered the night before. "Here's Frank's number. There's a payphone outside the diner down the street. Maybe it's time." Bob left Eddie with the phone number written on a scrap of paper and a promise to tell Frank that Eddie was alive and well. As he walked toward the diner, Bob reflected on the strange turns life could take, how two brothers who had both served their country could end up on such different paths. Dinner at the diner was a quiet affair, with Bob choosing a window seat where he could watch the people passing by on the sidewalk. The waitress, a woman in her 50s named Carol, recognized him from breakfast and treated him with the kind of friendly familiarity that made Bob feel welcomed rather than judged. "You're staying at that fancy hotel up the street, aren't you?" Carol asked as she refilled Bob's coffee cup. "For the weekend," Bob confirmed. Carol laughed. "I bet they're treating you real special up there. Those people think they're too good for the rest of us regular folks." Bob's experience at the hotel was still raw, and Carol's comment touched on feelings he had been trying to suppress. "Not exactly," he said. "Oh, I know the type," Carol continued, warming to the subject. "We get some of their guests in here sometimes. Usually the ones who discover that $30 room service burgers aren't all they're cracked up to be. They come in here acting like they're doing us a favor just by breathing our air. The hotel staff hasn't been particularly friendly," Bob admitted. "Doesn't surprise me one bit. My nephew worked there for about 6 months as a bellhop. Said the management made it clear that they only wanted staff who could maintain the proper image of the hotel. Translation: young, good-looking, and willing to kiss up to rich people." Carol's words reinforced Bob's growing understanding that his treatment at the hotel wasn't personal, but systemic, a reflection of an institutional culture that valued appearance and wealth over character and human dignity. It didn't make the experience less hurtful, but it provided context that helped Bob process his feelings. After dinner, Bob walked slowly back toward the hotel, taking his time and enjoying the cool evening air. As he approached the Grand Vista, he noticed a small crowd gathered outside the main entrance. Hotel security personnel were present, along with what appeared to be local police officers. Curious about the commotion, Bob approached close enough to hear fragments of conversation. Apparently, there had been some kind of incident involving a guest who had become belligerent in the hotel bar. The man, clearly intoxicated, was being escorted from the premises while loudly complaining about the quality of service and demanding to speak with the manager. "This place is a joke," the man was shouting. $40 for a martini, and the bartender doesn't even know how to make it properly. "I'm calling my lawyer. I'll have you shut down." Bob watched as hotel security and police handled the situation with professional efficiency. Marcus Delacroix appeared, speaking in calm tones with the officers and assuring them that the hotel would handle the matter internally. The intoxicated guest was eventually placed in a taxi, still protesting loudly about the injustices he had suffered. As the crowd dispersed, Bob found himself walking past Marcus, who was speaking with the head of security about implementing additional measures to prevent similar incidents. Bob couldn't help but note the contrast between the respectful way the intoxicated guest had been treated, despite his belligerent behavior, and the cold reception Bob had received simply for asking about a veteran discount. The intoxicated man had clearly been seen as a valuable customer whose complaints needed to be addressed with care and diplomacy. Bob, despite his polite demeanor and legitimate request, had been dismissed as unworthy of basic courtesy. The difference, Bob understood, lay not in their behavior, but in their perceived economic value to the establishment. Back in his room, Bob sat at the small desk and composed another email to Sarah, telling her about his day at the museum and his encounter with Tom and Danny. He mentioned meeting Eddie Kowalski and the connection to Frank from the Veterans Gathering, though he didn't go into detail about Eddie's circumstances. As Bob prepared for bed, He reflected on the day's events. He had experienced both the best and worst of human nature, the genuine respect and camaraderie of fellow veterans, the innocent curiosity of a young boy eager to learn about service and sacrifice, the comfortable welcome of working-class establishments that valued people over profit, and the cold indifference of those who measured worth only in material terms. Tomorrow would be his final full day at the hotel, and Bob was already looking forward to returning home. But he was also grateful for the experiences of the past 2 days, both positive and negative. He had reconnected with his veteran community, been reminded of the bonds that transcended economic circumstances, and gained a clearer understanding of his own worth that didn't depend on the approval of others. The city lights twinkled outside his window as Bob settled into the unfamiliar luxury of the hotel bed. Whatever tomorrow might bring, he would face it as he had faced everything else in his life, with quiet dignity, honest pride in his service and accomplishments, and an unshakable belief in the fundamental worth of every human being, regardless of their economic circumstances or social status. Sunday morning brought unexpected developments that would forever change the trajectory of Bob's weekend at the Grand Vista Hotel. Bob woke early, as usual, and was enjoying his morning coffee while watching the sunrise over the city when his cell phone rang. The caller ID showed a local number he didn't recognize. "Hello, Mr. Mitchell. This is Frank Kowalski. We met at the Veterans Gathering Friday night." Bob set down his coffee cup, immediately alert. "Of course, Frank. How did you get my number?" Frank's voice was thick with emotion. "My brother Eddie called me last night. He said you gave him my number, told him I've been asking about him. Mr. Mitchell, I can't thank you enough. I've been looking for Eddie for 2 years." The conversation continued for several minutes as Frank explained that he had immediately driven into the city to find Eddie. The brothers had spent the night talking, working through years of pain and misunderstanding. Frank had arranged for Eddie to enter a veterans rehabilitation program and had offered him a place to stay while he got back on his feet. "You saved my brother's life," Frank said. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't need to repay me," Bob replied. "Just take care of each other." After ending the call, Bob felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee or the morning sunlight. Sometimes the smallest actions could have the biggest consequences, and he was grateful that his simple act of kindness had helped reunite 2 brothers who needed each other. Bob's positive mood was enhanced when he checked his email and found a message from Sarah. She had been in contact with Dorothy Walsh, who had somehow gotten Sarah's email address from the Veterans Group contact list. Dorothy had written to tell Sarah what a wonderful impression Bob had made on everyone at the gathering and how much they were looking forward to seeing him at future meetings. "Dad, I'm so proud of you for going to that meeting," Sarah had written. "Dorothy said you really opened up and shared some stories she thought were important for other veterans to hear. She mentioned that several people exchanged contact information with you. I know how hard it's been for you to connect with other veterans, so this makes me incredibly happy." Bob read the email twice, surprised by how much Dorothy's words meant to him. For years, he had carried his war experiences in isolation, believing that his struggles and memories were burdens he should bear alone. Friday night's gathering had shown him the healing power of shared experience and mutual support. Bob decided to spend his final morning in the city visiting a small chapel he had noticed during his explorations. The Chapel of the Veterans was a modest stone building tucked between 2 larger structures, easily missed by anyone not specifically looking for it. Inside, the walls were lined with plaques commemorating local men and women who had served in various conflicts throughout American history. Bob found a quiet pew near the back and sat in contemplative silence. The chapel was empty except for an elderly priest who was arranging flowers at the altar. The peaceful atmosphere provided a stark contrast to the noise and bustle of the city outside, and Bob found himself reflecting on the events of the past few days. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of another visitor, a woman in her 70s who moved slowly with the aid of a walker. She settled into a pew near the front and bowed her head in what appeared to be prayer. Something about her bearing and the way she carried herself suggested a military bearing, and Bob noticed a small gold star pin on her jacket lapel. After a few minutes, the woman began to struggle with something in her purse, and Bob moved forward to offer assistance. "Can I help you with anything, ma'am?" The woman looked up with grateful eyes. "Oh, thank you, dear. I'm trying to find my reading glasses so I can read the inscription on my husband's plaque." Bob helped her locate the glasses, and she pointed to a brass plaque on the wall dedicated to Sergeant First Class William Morrison, who had been killed in action in Vietnam in 1969. The woman introduced herself as Helen Morrison, Bill's widow, and explained that she visited the chapel every Sunday to spend a few minutes with her husband's memory. He was 22 when he died, Helen said, her voice still carrying pain after more than 50 years. "We've been married just 8 months. I never remarried, never found anyone who could measure up to my Billy." Bob listened as Helen shared memories of her husband, a young soldier who had been full of dreams and plans for their future together. Her stories painted a picture of a man who had been kind, funny, and devoted to his wife and his country. Bob found himself sharing that he had also served in Vietnam, and Helen's eyes lit up with interest. "You were there around the same time as Billy," she said. "Maybe you knew him, or knew someone who knew him." Bob didn't want to give false hope, but he listened carefully as Helen described her husband's unit and the circumstances of his death. While Bob had no specific memory of Sergeant Morrison, the details were familiar in the way that all Vietnam stories shared common elements of youth, sacrifice, and loss. "Your husband was a hero," Bob told Helen. "Every man who served over there was a hero, whether they came home or not." "I've always believed that," Helen replied. "But for the longest time, it felt like nobody else did. People were so angry about the war, they forgot that the boys fighting it were just doing their duty." Bob understood Helen's frustration. The unpopularity of the Vietnam War had often translated into hostility toward the men who fought it, regardless of their individual beliefs about the conflict. Veterans had returned home to a country that seemed ashamed of their service, and many had carried that burden of rejection for decades. As Bob prepared to leave the chapel, Helen pressed a small card into his hand. It was a prayer card with her husband's picture on it, a young man in dress uniform with a bright smile and hopeful eyes. "I have hundreds of these," she said. "The funeral home made them for the service. I give them to veterans I meet. Billy would have liked knowing that other veterans remember him." Bob was deeply moved by the gesture and the faith it represented. Helen had spent 50 years keeping her husband's memory alive, visiting his plaque every Sunday, and sharing his story with anyone who would listen. Her devotion was a testament to love that transcended death and time. Bob returned to the hotel with a full heart and a renewed appreciation for the bonds that connect veterans across time and circumstance. He had learned from Helen Morrison that service and sacrifice create ripple effects that extend far beyond the individuals directly involved. Every veteran's story mattered. Every sacrifice deserved remembrance, and every act of remembrance honored not just the individual, but the larger community of those who had served. As Bob entered the hotel lobby, he noticed that the afternoon shift was busy with checkout activities for Sunday departing guests. The lobby buzzed with activity as bellhops moved luggage and families gathered their belongings. Bob decided to visit the business center one more time to send a proper thank you email to Dorothy Walsh and the other veterans from Friday night's gathering. The business center was busier than Bob had seen it, with several guests using computers and printers to handle last-minute travel arrangements. Bob found an available terminal and began composing his message, taking care to express his genuine gratitude for the warm welcome he had received. As Bob typed, he became aware of a commotion near the front desk. A well-dressed couple was engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with Marcus Delacroix. The woman's voice carried across the lobby as she expressed her displeasure with some aspect of their stay. "The service in the restaurant was absolutely unacceptable," she was saying. "We waited 20 minutes just to be seated, and then the waiter had the audacity to suggest we might prefer the less expensive wine selection. Do you have any idea who my husband is?" Marcus was responding with the same diplomatic professionalism Bob had observed during the incident with the intoxicated guest the night before. His voice remained calm and respectful as he assured the couple that their concerns would be addressed and their future stays would meet their expectations. Bob couldn't help but contrast this deferential treatment with his own experience at check-in. The couple's complaints seemed trivial compared to the systematic dismissal of veterans' worth that Bob had witnessed, yet they were being treated as valued customers whose concerns deserved immediate attention and resolution. As Bob finished his email and prepared to log off the computer, his attention was caught by a conversation between Marcus and another hotel manager near the business center entrance. They were discussing preparations for the following week's events, including a corporate retreat and a wedding reception. The Morrison wedding reception is going to be our biggest event of the month, the other manager was saying. 300 guests, premium menu, top-shelf bar service. Mrs. Morrison specifically requested our best service staff. Bob's ears perked up at the mention of the Morrison name, wondering if there could be any connection to Helen Morrison, the widow he had met at the chapel. As the conversation continued, Bob learned that the bride was the granddaughter of a William Morrison who had been killed in Vietnam, and that the reception was being held to honor his memory, as well as celebrate the wedding. The bride's grandmother is paying for everything, Marcus was explaining. She's been saving for this wedding for 20 years, apparently. Wants everything to be perfect because she says her late husband would have wanted to give his granddaughter the wedding of her dreams. Bob realized with certainty that they were talking about Helen Morrison and her husband Billy, the elderly woman who visited the chapel every Sunday, who had been alone for 50 years, was spending her life savings to honor her husband's memory by giving his granddaughter a wedding he would never see. The revelation struck Bob like a physical blow. Here was a woman whose husband had died serving his country, who had remained faithful to his memory for half a century, who was now spending everything she had to honor that memory through an act of love for the next generation. Yet Bob had witnessed firsthand how this same hotel treated veterans, how Marcus Delacroix viewed their demographic as unworthy of respect or consideration. Bob's anger began as a slow burn in his chest, growing stronger as he considered the injustice of the situation. Helen Morrison represented everything that was noble about military sacrifice and devotion, yet she was unknowingly giving her money to an establishment that held veterans in contempt. The irony was both cruel and infuriating. Bob saved his email and stood to leave, but found himself unable to simply walk away. An idea was forming in his mind, a way to address the injustice he had witnessed while honoring the memory of Sergeant William Morrison and supporting Helen's dream for her granddaughter's wedding. Instead of returning to his room, Bob approached the concierge desk where a young man named Kevin was helping guests with various requests. Kevin had been friendly to Bob during their brief interactions over the weekend, treating him with basic courtesy regardless of his appearance. Kevin, Bob said, I need to ask you about someone who's planning an event here next weekend. Helen Morrison, her granddaughter's wedding reception. Kevin checked his computer and nodded. Yes, the Morrison wedding. It's going to be a beautiful event. Mrs. Morrison has been so specific about every detail. She wants everything to be perfect. I met Mrs. Morrison today, Bob explained. Her husband was killed in Vietnam. She's been alone for 50 years, and now she's spending her life savings on this wedding reception because she says her husband would have wanted his granddaughter to have the perfect day. Kevin's expression grew more serious as he absorbed the significance of Bob's words. That's incredibly touching, he said. I had no idea about the backstory. Kevin, I want to help make sure the reception really is perfect. What would it cost to upgrade every aspect of the event? Better flowers, premium menu, top-shelf liquor, extra service staff, whatever would make it the kind of celebration that Sergeant Morrison would have wanted for his granddaughter. Kevin looked surprised by the request. Mr. Mitchell, that kind of comprehensive upgrade would be very expensive. We're talking about thousands of dollars in additional costs. How much? Bob asked directly. Kevin spent several minutes calculating various upgrade options, explaining the costs of different menu selections, floral arrangements, and service levels. The total additional cost for a truly premium reception would be approximately $8,000, a sum that represented more money than Bob had ever possessed at one time. I want to pay for all the upgrades, Bob said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the decision he was making. Mr. Mitchell, are you sure? That's a very generous gesture, but it's also a significant amount of money. Bob had never been more sure of anything in his life. Mrs. Morrison has given 50 years of her life honoring her husband's sacrifice. The least I can do is help her give their granddaughter the wedding that Sergeant Morrison would have wanted. Kevin agreed to make the arrangements, and Bob provided his credit card information for the upgrades. The transaction would nearly exhaust his savings account, money he had been carefully accumulating for years, but Bob felt a sense of rightness about the decision that transcended financial considerations. As Kevin processed the payment and upgrade requests, Bob felt a profound sense of purpose. This was his way of honoring not just Sergeant Morrison's memory, but the memory of all the veterans who had been dismissed and devalued by people like Marcus Delacroix. Helen Morrison's granddaughter would have the wedding of her dreams, paid for by the same demographic that the hotel's management considered unworthy of basic respect. Monday morning arrived with unseasonably warm weather and clear skies, perfect conditions for Bob's drive home. As he packed his simple duffel bag and prepared to check out of the Grand Vista Hotel, Bob felt a complex mixture of emotions about his weekend experience. The veteran gathering and his encounters with people like Tom Richardson, Dorothy Walsh, and Helen Morrison had enriched his life in ways he was still processing. Yet the cold treatment from hotel management had served as a stark reminder of how society often viewed veterans, particularly those without obvious wealth or status. Bob made his way to the front desk for checkout, where he found Jessica working the morning shift once again. Her expression when she saw him approaching suggested she remembered their interaction from Friday afternoon, though her professional demeanor remained intact. "Checking out, Mr. Mitchell?" Jessica asked, her tone neutral but lacking warmth. "Yes, room 814, Bob replied, handing over his key card. As Jessica processed his checkout, Bob noticed Marcus Delacroix emerge from the back office, carrying what appeared to be event planning documents. Marcus glanced in Bob's direction with the same dismissive indifference he had shown throughout the weekend, clearly eager for this particular guest to complete his departure. "Everything appears to be in order," Jessica said, handing Bob his receipt. "Thank you for staying with us at the Grand Vista." The words were professionally appropriate, but delivered without genuine sentiment. Bob accepted the receipt and was preparing to leave when Kevin, the concierge who had helped him arrange the wedding reception upgrades, approached the front desk. "Mr. Mitchell," Kevin said with genuine warmth, "I wanted to thank you again for what you're doing for the Morrison family. Mrs. Morrison called this morning to confirm some details, and when I told her about the upgrades, she was so overwhelmed she started crying." Bob felt a flush of satisfaction, knowing that his gesture had already brought joy to Helen Morrison. "I'm glad she's pleased," he said simply. Jessica looked confused by the exchange, and Marcus, overhearing Kevin's comments, moved closer to the front desk with obvious interest. "What upgrades are you referring to, Kevin?" Marcus asked. Kevin glanced uncertainly between Marcus and Bob before responding. Mr. Mitchell arranged to pay for comprehensive upgrades to the Morrison wedding reception next weekend. Premium menu, enhanced floral arrangements, additional service staff, top-shelf bar service. It's going to be an incredible event. Marcus's expression shifted from curiosity to surprise to something approaching disbelief as he processed the information. His eyes moved to Bob, clearly reassessing the older man in work clothes who had just spent $8,000 to upgrade a stranger's wedding reception. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, his voice carefully controlled, "but there must be some mistake. The Morrison account shows a substantial upgrade payment, but there's no mistake," Bob said quietly. "I arranged and paid for the upgrades." The lobby fell silent except for the background murmur of other guests and staff going about their business. Marcus stared at Bob with an expression that suggested his entire understanding of the situation was being fundamentally challenged. "Mr. Mitchell," Marcus said slowly, "I don't understand. You're paying for upgrades to an event you're not even attending." Mrs. Morrison's husband was killed in Vietnam in 1969. Bob explained, his voice carrying the weight of shared experience and understanding. She's been alone for 50 years, and now she's spending her life savings to give their granddaughter the kind of wedding that Sergeant Morrison would have wanted. I thought the least I could do was help make sure it's truly special. Marcus's face went through several changes of expression as the implications of Bob's words sank in. Here was the same man Marcus had dismissively categorized as an undesirable guest, the same demographic he had declared incompatible with the hotel's target market, who had just demonstrated a level of generosity and nobility that put Marcus's own values and judgments into sharp perspective. "That's very generous," Marcus said, though his voice suggested he was still struggling to process the situation. Jessica looked equally stunned. Her training had taught her to assess guests based on appearance and perceived wealth, to adjust her service level accordingly. The revelation that this unassuming older man in work clothes had just spent more money on a stranger's happiness than most guests spent on their entire stay challenged every assumption she had made about him. Bob shouldered his duffel bag and prepared to leave, but Kevin's voice stopped him. "Mr. Mitchell, Mrs. Morrison specifically asked if she could meet you to thank you in person. She said she's never experienced such kindness from a stranger." "That's not necessary," Bob replied. "I'm just glad I could help." "She insisted," Kevin continued. "She's coming in this afternoon to review the final arrangements. Would you be willing to wait, or perhaps come back?" Bob considered the request. His original plan had been to drive straight home, to return to the familiar comfort of his small apartment above the hardware store. But something about Helen Morrison's desire to express her gratitude touched him deeply. Here was a woman who understood sacrifice and service, who had devoted her life to honoring her husband's memory. "I could stay a few more hours," Bob said finally. Marcus cleared his throat, drawing attention back to himself. "Mr. Mitchell, perhaps we could offer you complimentary accommodations for an additional night? Given the circumstances, it seems appropriate." Bob looked at Marcus with mild surprise. The offer was clearly motivated by the hotel manager's realization that he had badly misjudged Bob's character and circumstances, but it represented a significant change from the cold indifference Bob had experienced throughout his stay. "I appreciate the offer," Bob said, "but I'll just wait in the lobby." "Actually," Marcus said, his voice taking on a more urgent tone, "I'd like to speak with you privately, if you have a few minutes. Perhaps we could use my office?" Bob was curious about what Marcus might have to say, so he agreed to the meeting. Marcus led him through the elegant lobby to a hallway lined with administrative offices, finally opening the door to a spacious room with windows overlooking the city. Marcus's office reflected the same attention to luxury and status that characterized the hotel itself. Expensive furniture, artwork, and awards covered the walls, creating an environment designed to impress visitors with the occupant's success and importance. Bob took a seat in a leather chair across from Marcus's desk, waiting to hear what the hotel manager had to say. "Mr. Mitchell," Marcus began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with how to proceed. "I owe you an apology." "Several apologies, actually." Bob remained silent, allowing Marcus to continue. "I've been in the hospitality industry for 15 years," Marcus said, "and I pride myself on understanding people, on being able to assess guests and provide appropriate service. This weekend, I failed completely in that assessment regarding you." Marcus went on to acknowledge that he had observed Bob's treatment by staff, had overheard his request for a veteran discount, and had made judgments based solely on appearance and perceived economic status. His voice carried genuine remorse as he admitted to dismissing veterans as incompatible with the hotel's image and target demographic. "What you've done for Mrs. Morrison," Marcus continued, "demonstrates a level of character and generosity that puts my own values to shame. You've spent more money on a stranger's happiness than most of our regular guests spend on themselves, and you did it purely out of respect for a fellow veteran sacrifice." Bob listened to Marcus's words without interruption, recognizing the difficulty the hotel manager was having in acknowledging his misjudgments. It took courage to admit error, especially for someone in Marcus's position, and Bob appreciated the genuine nature of the apology. "I want to make this right," Marcus said. "Not just for you, but for all veterans. I realize now that I've been guilty of exactly the kind of prejudice and short-sightedness that I always believed I was above. Marcus proposed implementing a formal veterans discount program at the Grand Vista. Not just a token percentage off, but a meaningful reduction that would make the hotel accessible to veterans regardless of their economic circumstances. He also suggested partnering with local veterans organizations to host regular events and gatherings, making the hotel a welcoming place for those who had served. "I'd like you to help me design these programs," Marcus said. "You understand what veterans need and value in ways that I clearly don't. Would you be willing to work with me on this?" Bob was touched by the sincerity of Marcus's request, though he also recognized the irony of the situation. A hotel manager who had spent the weekend dismissing veterans as undesirable was now asking one of those same veterans to help him understand their worth and needs. "I'd be willing to help," Bob said finally, "but not for you or your hotel. I'd do it for veterans like Helen Morrison's husband, for men like Eddie Kowalski who are struggling on the streets, for all the veterans who deserve to be treated with dignity and respect." Marcus nodded gratefully. "That's exactly the perspective I need to understand." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Kevin peered in to inform them that Helen Morrison had arrived and was waiting in the lobby. Bob and Marcus made their way back to the front desk, where Bob saw Helen sitting in one of the lobby's elegant chairs, looking somewhat overwhelmed by the hotel's opulent surroundings. When Helen saw Bob approaching, her face lit up with recognition and gratitude. She rose carefully from her chair and moved toward him with the aid of her walker, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I can't begin to thank you for what you've done. When Kevin told me about the upgrades, I was so overwhelmed I could barely speak." Bob took Helen's hands in his, feeling the delicate strength of someone who had endured decades of loss while maintaining faith and dignity. "Mrs. Morrison, it's my honor to help. Your husband's sacrifice deserves to be remembered and celebrated. Billy would have loved knowing that another veteran helped give our granddaughter the wedding of her dreams," Helen said. "He always believed that veterans should look out for each other." As they talked, Helen shared more details about her granddaughter's upcoming wedding and her own efforts to make the event special despite her limited resources. Her love for her family and devotion to her husband's memory shone through every word, reinforcing Bob's conviction that his financial sacrifice had been worthwhile. Marcus stood nearby, observing the interaction with growing understanding of what he had failed to recognize throughout Bob's stay. Here was a demonstration of values that couldn't be measured in income or social status: sacrifice, honor, loyalty, and compassion. These were the qualities that defined true worth. Yet Marcus had been blind to them because they didn't align with his narrow definition of desirable clientele. As Helen prepared to leave after finalizing the reception details, she turned back to Bob one final time. "Mr. Mitchell, I want you to know that you've restored my faith in human kindness. In a world that often seems to have forgotten about people like Billy and what they gave up for this country, you've shown that their sacrifice still matters to someone." Helen's words hit Bob with unexpected force, bringing tears to his eyes that he quickly wiped away. For 50 years, he had carried the weight of service that seemed increasingly unappreciated and irrelevant. Helen's gratitude reminded him that his service and the service of all veterans retained meaning and value regardless of society's changing attitudes. After Helen left, Bob prepared to make his own departure. Marcus walked with him to the lobby entrance, continuing their conversation about the veteran programs they had discussed. Other hotel staff members, having heard about Bob's extraordinary generosity, watched with newfound respect as he made his way through the lobby. Jessica approached as Bob neared the exit, her demeanor completely transformed from their earlier interactions. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying genuine warmth, "I want to apologize for how I treated you when you checked in. I made assumptions based on appearance, and I was completely wrong. What you've done for Mrs. Morrison is one of the most beautiful gestures I've ever witnessed." Bob accepted Jessica's apology graciously, understanding that she, like Marcus, had been operating within a system that valued superficial markers of worth over character and substance. "We all make judgments sometimes," Bob said. "The important thing is being willing to reconsider them when we learn better." As Bob walked toward his weathered pickup truck in the hotel parking lot, he reflected on the transformation that had occurred during his stay at the Grand Vista. He had arrived feeling unwelcome and judged, treated as an intruder whose presence diminished the establishment's carefully cultivated image. He was leaving with the respect and gratitude of staff members who had come to understand that true worth couldn't be measured by the standards they had previously employed. More importantly, Bob had reconnected with his veteran community, had helped reunite two brothers who needed each other, and had honored the memory of a fallen Marine while bringing joy to his devoted widow. These accomplishments mattered far more than any recognition from hotel management or staff. Bob climbed into his truck and started the engine, the familiar sound of comfort after 3 days surrounded by the artificial elegance of the hotel. As he drove through the city toward the highway that would take him home, Bob passed the small chapel where he had met Helen Morrison. He said a silent prayer for Sergeant William Morrison, for Eddie and Frank Kowalski, for all the veterans who had struggled to find their place in a society that didn't always appreciate their sacrifices. The drive home gave Bob time to process the events of the weekend and to consider the future. Marcus Delacroix had asked for his help in developing veteran-friendly programs at the Grand Vista, an opportunity to create positive change that might benefit other veterans facing similar challenges. Bob was tentatively excited about the possibility of using his experience to help others, though he remained cautiously optimistic about Marcus's commitment to genuine change. More immediately, Bob was looking forward to reconnecting with Dorothy Walsh and the other veterans from Friday night's gathering. For the first time in years, he felt part of a community that understood and valued his experiences. The monthly meetings Dorothy had mentioned suddenly seemed not just appealing, but necessary. As Bob's truck carried him away from the city and toward the small town he called home, he felt a sense of completion that had been missing from his life for decades. The weekend had reminded him that his service mattered, that his sacrifices had meaning, and that there were still people in the world who understood the true value of honor, duty, and selfless service. The Grand Vista Hotel had initially represented everything Bob felt excluded from: wealth, status, and social acceptance based on superficial measures of worth. By the end of his stay, it had become something different, a place where genuine character had triumphed over prejudice, where understanding had replaced judgment, and where one veteran's generosity had honored the memory of another's sacrifice. Bob Mitchell drove toward home with his head held high, carrying with him the